Everybody, hope you found the candy on the table outside. I don't think we brought enough food somehow. Welcome back. I'm going to introduce Ashley Beck and Cristopher Swanson to present Dangerous Dog Investigations.
Thank you. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Sounds like everyone had their candy. You're all awake. Our goal is not to put you to sleep in the next hour or so. But my name is, again, Ashley Beck. I'm a Senior Deputy District Attorney at the Denver DA's office. Since 2018, I have been handling most of our animal cruelty investigations and partnering with Denver Animal Protection to get those filed, and also file and do our intake for state-level dangerous dog cases.
I'm Officer Swanson. I work with Denver Animal Protection. I've been with Denver Animal Protection now for a little over 3 years. Took kind of an unconventional route getting into animal welfare, to be honest. Initially got my degree in criminal justice, thinking I wanted to be a police officer. I think senior year of college, I realized it wasn't the best choice for me or my family. Decided to work as a juvenile corrections officer up in Golden for 4 years. And then during that time, I also worked as an intern death investigator for the Adams County Coroner's Office. At the end, I was like, okay, don't want to be a police officer, don't want to work with juveniles, and don't want my whole job surrounded by death. So I thought I'd give animals a chance, so I'm here now.
Also, if the screen goes blank, it's not my fault. The computer's dying, so I'm looking for a cord. Also. Clicker. Thank you.
I'll give you that end.
All right, also, did this stop working?
Is the pointer not working?
No, but it's cool. I can
Okay.
improvise. Boom.
It'll probably kick back on. Maybe.
Okay, I'll just give it a good shake. All right, so just so we know our audience, who here is sworn law enforcement? Okay, and just animal protection folks or animal control? Okay, so the vast majority of you, great. So the things that we're going to cover today, I'm not going to read this, you all can read, but we're going to kind of just do a pretty broad overview of dangerous dog investigations, starting with why these cases matter. That's probably pretty obvious to you guys. Going over some charging options and considerations, obviously investigative considerations, cost of care. I know Tara, who just went before us, touched on that, so we'll sort of zoom right over that. And then talk a little bit about the penalties and then do a case study that we worked on. So why do these cases matter, right? You guys are all in this profession because you love animals, and it is hard to get these cases, but you're also all in this profession because you understand that there has to be an equilibrium and a balance between, obviously, companion animals and making sure that our citizens are safe. So we can't have dogs who are inclined to go bite and attack or kill people just running on the loose in our communities. The legislature recognized that, and so that is actually codified and written into our state statute, and we have this legislative declaration that basically says dangerous dogs are a big problem. They're essentially a public health concern, and so that's why we care. Every year, approximately 4.5 million people are bitten by dogs in the US. That's a pretty staggering statistic. But obviously, if you step back, you realize the vast majority of those are pretty minor bites, but you do have those more serious offenses, and those are going to be the cases that you folks are probably going to be investigating. And obviously, kids and dogs can sometimes be a pretty bad combination. Children don't necessarily have the ability to recognize body language in dogs, signs that dogs really don't want them, fondling them, riding on them, being annoying, and so those dogs lash out, but that is obviously still a concern. And so our kids are often our number one victims. I threw this in here. I'm sure you guys all know. Thank you for the laughter at the memes. I threw a couple in just to keep you awake, paying attention. So mandatory reporting of bites is governed under 25-4603, and obviously you're going to be getting reports from doctors, anybody who comes across a bite. You folks obviously are mandatory reporters, and so it's just something important to be aware that that is out there, and it does not require that the citizen or the victim be on board with that. So whether or not they want it reported, obviously it's a mandatory reporting situation, so they don't have to give consent, you still have to report it.
And then being prepared. So something that kind of stuck with me playing sports when I was younger, coach told me Failing to prepare is preparing to fail. So I know we all probably have our routines once we get in, check our trucks, make sure all of our equipment's in there. But especially for dangerous dogs, we need to make sure we have a catch pole if it can fit inside the cab, our Kevlar gloves or cat gloves readily available, and then ropes, any other materials that'll help keep us safe so that once we get on scene, if those dogs, I'm gonna refer to dogs because that's typically what it is, right? So if those dogs are swarming our truck, we get on scene, we have a way that we can contain them and protect ourselves, either getting out of the vehicle or maybe rolling down the window. Assessing the situation prior to arrival and making a plan. So this is where we get the call through dispatch, and we can kind of determine, the entirety of this, or a portion of the situation, I guess not the entirety. How many dogs are there? What kind of breeds are they? Are they strong athletic breeds? Are they Chihuahuas? If there are multiple dogs, definitely consider calling for backup, and then calling for RPs or witnesses while they're on scene can help to kind of determine best next steps. We can call for PD to go to the scene. They can run reds and blues, we can't. And then what I like doing is notifying dispatch probably when I'm like a minute or so out from the call, let them know I'm on scene. This way, once you get on scene, we can just respond right away. And obviously make sure dispatch is acknowledging you're on scene. So when we show up on scene, first, the health and safety of the humans and the animals should always be kind of at the forefront. So if the attack is currently happening, when we're on scene, we need to, as safely as possible, capture those dogs, take them into our custody, attend to any of the human victims, and then if there are injured animals or deceased animals as a result of the incident, the deceased animal we may want to impound if it's a part of the investigation. We can send it up for a necropsy to get a better idea of the cause and manner of death. And then obviously caring for those injured animals. And then once the whole scene is safe and secure, we can dive into the investigation piece.
And I'll just add, when he says sort of assess the situation before you arrive, obviously that's critically important because that real-time information that you are getting while you are en route is going to influence how you are responding to that scene and how you are responding to that investigation. If you have information that is being relayed through dispatch that you have someone essentially bleeding out in the street, he's able to call and get a bus there sooner rather than later. And so it is really important to be engaged with dispatch. I expect all of you are already doing that, but just make sure, even on these cases, that you are engaged with dispatch and trying to figure out what exactly you are responding to. Is it really emergent? Do I need potentially life-saving paramedics and folks on scene? Or is this a little bit more, we can wait, things will be okay, they can transport themselves?
The other thing is, I was just going to piggyback a little bit, is if we are arriving on scene and the attack is currently happening, make yourself this might be on another slide. It's actually on the next slide. But making yourself super visible, be loud, honk your horn, yell. This does a couple things. It can distract the dogs away from the person or the other animal that it's attacking. The other thing it does is it may provide a little bit of relief to the victim, like, hey, help is here. And then if it's going on in a neighborhood or maybe a more commercial place, people will see that you're there and maybe they will reach out to you to say, hey, I'll give you a statement based on what I saw.
And keep in mind, sometimes scenes move, right? They start out at the corner of somewhere and maybe they're able to get the dog off of them, and so your victim is walking away thinking they are walking to safety. Meanwhile, you are responding to where dispatch told you to respond. So again, if you're kind of honking or if you're driving around and making it apparent that you are there, if people who witnessed the attack or the victim see you drive up, they can flag you down rather than have that disconnect and kind of wasted time.
The other thing too is, we probably all are really familiar with kind of like nosy neighbors that, there's an attack going on and everyone's coming outside and everyone wants to be outside and see what's going on. So if you do get on scene, you see other people outside, be really commanding with your voice, tell them to get inside to make sure no further damage is happening.
All right, charging considerations. So I imagine all of your jurisdictions have either local ordinances or municipal codes that have statutes that are relevant to dangerous dog or vicious dogs. You also obviously have a state statute that we'll get into. And so really one of your first questions that you have to answer when you respond to one of these cases is, am I going to pursue this as a municipal or ordinance violation, or am I going to take this to the state level? And that is something that you really sort of have to figure out earlier on, depending on how the investigation unfolds. Chris and I were talking before this presentation, at least in Denver, in the Denver Revised Municipal Code, there is actually a section that says if a municipal warrant is written and executed and basically covers the same conduct that a state charge covers, but it is a municipal warrant, I cannot then take that municipal case and elevate it to a state charge. I am precluded from doing that because the warrant was done at the municipal level. And so in some circumstances, it doesn't matter. You can just begin your investigation and you figure out it's pretty serious and maybe you should take it to the state. But there are times where you need to make that initial assessment, specifically if you're writing paper and executing search warrants. So just have this sort of in the back of your mind.
Yeah, the other thing on that too is state charges will, I'm sure you guys are familiar with, will follow people, wherever they go. The muni charges, we just don't have a database that we can access anyways here in Denver set up for that. So that's just another sort of consideration with that.
And so when you are kind of trying to figure out what do I do, what's the right course of action here? Do I, issue a warning? Is it super minor? Do I issue a ticket for a city violation? Or do I elevate this to state charges? Some of the things you should consider are, is there any history with this specific dog or any history with this particular owner? If there has been history, have they been receptive to corrective measures, or are they just blowing off the system and they don't care that their dog has now attacked the sixth person?
The other thing Ashley was kind of touching on with warrants as well that we keep in mind is typically, if we know that we're going to be impounding these dogs on these dangerous animal charges, when we show up on scene, people think we're taking their dogs no matter what the call is or what the complaint is. So now it's heightened for the dog owner. So them kind of moving the evidence or I guess the dogs can be part of the evidence, but the perpetrators in whatever incident, we can likely write up that warrant, a muni warrant, a little bit quicker than the detective may be able to and execute.
Yeah, so expediency of investigation might play into your consideration. Obviously, the severity of the bite or the attack. The number of victims involved, if you've got a number of victims, perhaps that's more appropriate for state level charges. Whether in your assessment the dog really does pose a danger, right? We all know what a dangerous dog looks like. Any dog can be a dangerous dog. But we know that there are some dogs that truly have the propensity and are actually aggressive and a true danger to the community. And then there's your dog that for whatever reason its buttons got pushed and this was a total one-off. You guys are the most equipped to sort of make that assessment. It's not pure science, right? You can misjudge it, but you really are in the best position to try to decide, is this dog really a public safety concern, or was this just a one-off? And if the one-off, maybe it goes to the state or the city level. If really a dog that we probably don't want out in the public, then maybe you're elevating to the state charge. And I'll talk a little bit more about the penalties and some of the mandatory euthanasia provisions as to why that might be your consideration. And then obviously if the owner is on scene, how they handle the incident. Are they appropriately concerned? You don't just let somebody off because they behave appropriately and they do the right thing, right? I'm not saying that. But again, if they are receptive to direction, if they understand the severity of what just happened, if they are receptive to the information you are providing them, maybe that's a consideration as to whether they get a state charge or a municipal violation. And the outcome for the dog I just touched on again. When you're talking state charges, we do have some mandatory euthanasia policies written into the statute. So that is a consideration. I don't know all of these, but I did some Googling. Google is amazing. There are obviously various municipal codes, regulations, and ordinance. These are just a couple. They're all very similar to each other. You guys know your local ordinances, but make sure you are familiar with the nuances between your local ordinances and your state statute, because that will also obviously influence whether or not you are pursuing a state charge or a local charge. All right, the state stuff. My understanding is Tara Buckhalter just went over this, so I will sort of just skim it. Hopefully you guys are all aware of our unlawful ownership of a dangerous dog statute. A couple of things that I would point out is it's a person who owns, possesses, harbors, or keeps, or has custody or control. So that can be a lot of people associated with one dog, right? We're not talking about just the person that adopted the dog whose name is on the paperwork. That's not the only person you can charge. Can you charge a dog walker? You can, right? You could charge the whole family if it's appropriate, if they're all aware of these dogs' propensities. And so just make sure that you are kind of thinking about who is the most appropriate person or who are the most appropriate people when you are issuing state charges, and don't confine yourself necessarily to just one person. It's going to depend on the circumstances. If you have somebody who's the primary owner who is out walking the dog when the incident happens, it makes sense to charge them and not the spouse who's at home potentially, right? So use your common sense, but just don't confine yourself to necessarily the obvious suspect. Our penalties are based on the severity of the bite or the severity of the attack. So if your dog inflicts bodily injury upon a person or injures or kills any other domestic animal, you are looking at a Class 2 misdemeanor. If the dog inflicts serious bodily injury upon any person, it's a Class 1 misdemeanor. If it happens again, whether or not it's the same dog, but if it is the same owner, and they have a prior M1 conviction, so a prior conviction under a state charge, it elevates to a Class 6 felony. And that sort of ties into what we were talking about a little bit ago in terms of the owner's receptiveness to understanding the gravity of the situation and really the consequences available to them. If they're not really playing ball and they're not getting the message, obviously that M1 is going to be elevated to an F6 if they continue to engage in this same behavior. So that's also a consideration. If they're convicted under a city or municipal ordinance, this does not elevate it. It has to be a prior M1. And then obviously if the dog causes death to a person, you are in your Class 5 felony. I forgot to say this. This should be obvious. If anyone has questions at any time, please feel free to interject. You don't need to hold them till the end. Affirmative defenses, I think Tara also touched on briefly. They're up here. They are codified in the state statute. Really what you want to be considering here is just be aware of these. And when you are responding and conducting your investigation and people are telling you things, if it fits into one of these, does that necessarily kill your case then and there? Does that mean you can't present it to your DA's office or write a violation? No, right? It's information you're going to want to document, and it might be the end of your case, right? Your DA might say they have a really viable affirmative defense. I don't think I'm going to file this because I don't think I can disprove that. That's what an affirmative defense is it obligates the prosecuting authority, whether that's a city attorney or a district attorney, to disprove these things. And so we might reject or refuse that case, but we might say that's nonsense. That defense is not available to them, and we might still pursue it. So keep an eye out for facts that would potentially fall into this. Maybe flag it for your DA if you are going to the state level or your city attorney at the city level. But it does not necessarily mean you cannot pursue that case.
And then we're going into this is basically just a graphic of the Ian Dunbar bite scale. So typically, right, we're dealing within 2 to 5, typically, hopefully not 6. And level 1 is just aggressive behavior. It's not really a bite, maybe lunging, air snapping, stuff like that. So I'm sure you guys are all pretty familiar with this, but the prognosis for the dogs, it gets worse as the levels increase. So level 3, prognosis is okay. Level 4, it's getting to a poor level. Level 5 is really bad prognosis for the dog. And then you hear, dog tasted blood and now it wants more blood type thing, which is actually true. When dogs do bite and they break skin, they are more likely to bite in the future. They're scared, this person's coming towards them, they bite the person goes away, dog learns if I bite, it solves kind of my fear at that point.
Just out of curiosity, I'm going to say everyone has probably experienced a level 1 bite. Who here has responded to or investigated a level 6? Anyone? A couple, okay. What about level 5? A lot of folks. Okay, and obviously hands are going to keep going up as we go down. Okay. Oh, this is the fun interactive portion of the presentation.
Graphic.
We're going to show you some photos, and they're going to be really hard to figure out, but also graphic warning as we progress. There are some graphic images. I am sure you have all seen these in real life, but also I take no offense if you want to close your head or close your eyes, duck your head, or just close your head and stop receiving information is also a viable option. But we just want you guys to kind of be thinking critically when you see these sort of things. It's subjective, right? One person might say, I think that's a level 2. Someone might say that's a level 3. We have the Ian Dunbar scale to sort of try to narrow the discrepancies between folks who think maybe it's a level 2 versus a level 3. But I was just curious if folks see different things in some of these next few slides.
So I know it's kind of hard, from a computer screen, even with it all blown up here, to kind of determine what level of a bite you think it is. How many people think this is a level 3 bite? And by the way, all these pictures are examples of what we kind of thought was the same level of bite. Level 3s? Level 2? Yeah, we classified this as a level 2 bite.
Is there anyone who disagrees with that? Who's willing to sort of speak up and say why you might classify one of those pictures differently?
Because he's... It's tough to tell. There might be a small spot that bled, but yeah, pretty subjective.
But right, I mean that's the thing, right? We're talking about level 3, right? Is generally the bruising into level 4, not so much level 2. And so I could see potentially how someone is classifying that differently. Those are on-scene judgments that you guys have to make. And when you are ultimately assisting in a prosecution, if you are testifying in court, that is going to be on you as the expert. You should be designated as an expert, and you will have to justify your opinion. And whatever opinion you hold is really the right opinion. It's based on your training, your experience, your knowledge of the Ian Dunbar scale, so long as you can back up that opinion.
Yeah, and then just generally, like in my experience, it is, I feel like it does add value to not only say, this looks like a level 2 bite, but describe it as best you can. So then, you have a little bit more to go off of. People are more kind of understanding of what the injury was.
Do you want to know how many jurors know the difference between a level 3 and a level 4 bite? Yes. It means absolutely nothing to them, right? It's kind of like cop talk. We all know what it means when you say, I contacted so-and-so. What does contact mean, right? I arrested them. I physically apprehended them. Same thing. It was a level 2 bite, means absolutely nothing. And to a lot of prosecutors, I'm going to tell you, it also means not much. If they have not handled these cases before, seeing that written in your report is not going to flag anything for them. Maybe they Google it, maybe they don't, they just write it off. So, to Officer Swanson's point, absolutely. Articulate what it is that made that a level 2 and why it's a relevant assessment.
Yeah, and I don't necessarily think it's bad to add, that the injuries appear consistent with the level 2 bite, but also, just describing it and explaining it.
All right, ready for the next one? Okay. What do we think?
Some 3s. Anyone else?
Couple 4s. Anyone at a 6? No, okay. Nobody died. Hate to tell you, nobody died.
Yeah. Again, yeah, really subjective, but we classified these as level 3s. For those did anyone say level 4?
Couple.
And it's okay if you did, because this is subjective.
What are some of the things for the 4s out there? What are you looking at? How would you defend that position?
So like the bottom picture, you can see where the front, like the top insiders, made the contact with the dwelling and then brought the inside ears in the bottom picture.
This one?
I could follow that. Yeah. Anybody else? So I think you are perfectly justified. I think these are primarily 3s, but I think if you can articulate again why that would be elevated, absolutely.
Yeah, if you guys figured out, the first one was level 2, second one was level 3.
Don't spoil it. Don't spoil it.
But yeah, we classified these ones as level 4s.
So definitely level 4s, right? And pictures are worth a million words in these scenarios, right? You can describe this, but it is hard to really understand the difference between these bite levels when you are just articulating what it is that you saw, which you absolutely should do, and you will be your DA's favorite person if you have a well-written report. But these photos are worth 1,000 words. They really help us understand and start to speak your language. So document the heck out of these cases. It's really important.
Generally, too, when we're taking photos of injuries, it is good to kind of zoom out so we know, well, in most cases, what extremity we're looking at, and then kind of zoom back in so we can see in more detail what that injury was.
Fun anecdote, we did, well, not fun actually, I should not say that. We had a very sad case where a little 8-year-old boy was bit by a dog in the testicle. We did have some pictures of that. I spared you that image. But privacy considerations with something like that? Absolutely. Do you still probably need to take that picture? Right. But that's where it's going to be important, and we're going to get to that a little bit later on with kind of how you are approaching victims and witnesses, and if it's a minor child, how you are engaging with those parents and not just treating it like a case, understanding the embarrassment that comes with that, understanding a mother's privacy concerns for her son, and things of that nature to really get the evidence that you need in order to successfully prosecute a case. When I was putting this together, I did not necessarily think about the size of this screen and the graphic image that appears on the next slide, so apologies. You ready? All right. Yes. Anybody disagree that those are probably level 5 bites? Does everybody know what part of the body that left-hand photo is? Yeah. Probably a leg, but to Officer Swanson's point, again, you're going to want that full body picture so that I know what it is that I am looking at there, because I could see that potentially as an arm. It's not abundantly clear, but take those kind of larger distance photos and then zoom in as you get into that area to show the severity and the graphic nature of it. It depends, would be my answer. So what I will say is every DA really wants an SBI form, and if your jurisdiction does not have one, ask for one. They might not have it in this particular context when you're talking about dangerous dog bites, but they will have it in your domestic violence units, things like that, as well as, for ag robs, if somebody gets shot, there's an SBI form. Every DA's office has it. Get your hands on that and see when you are responding out, if you are responding out at the time that this happens and you are accompanying the victim to the hospital, take that SBI form with you and see if you can get a doctor to sign it. I have prosecuted cases where a doctor has said this is not SBI, and I take this to a jury and I put a before and after photo on, because how long does it take for a case to get in front of a jury? Right? Months, years. That is likely going to be healed before it is ever in front of a jury. And so I can show a before and after picture, and I can leave that up to the jury's determination to say, yeah, that's absolutely permanent disfigurement, even if my doctor said no. But ideally, I have a doctor who can say, yeah, that is permanent disfigurement, and then it's just easy for my jury. If it heals totally fine, which I would be very surprised by, you might have some trouble. So it really depends.
Yeah, I think if you can get, like Ashley was saying, if you can get a doctor to say it's permanent disfigurement, that's great. I think most common are those bites, above the shoulder, neck, face, for cases like that.
And it can be very frustrating, because I think those of us who deal with this are very clear that that is SBI, right? And that is either going to be permanent disfigurement or perhaps impairment. Maybe that person can never actually walk the same because of significant persisting pain or things of that nature. Doctors are sort of wonderful, wonderful people who don't really want to find themselves in court because that's not their job. They are supposed to be in the ER room. And so sometimes they are reticent to really sign that SBI form, or they just have a different opinion because they've seen it all, right? Their spectrum is a little bit different than our spectrum. I have gunshot wounds and stab wounds that before the law just changed, they said we're not SBI. And I'm like, how do you get shot and it's not SBI? So, doctors can do strange things because this is just not really the world that they are living in. But we can overcome that most of the time. I don't have any dead people pictures. You all know what a level 6 looks like. Okay. All right, so building your case. What is it that your prosecuting attorneys, whether they are at the city level or the state level, really want? We kind of want it all, I'll be honest. ID. We really need to establish ID. Who is the owner or the custodian of this dog? Who is it that we are charging? And how did you reach that conclusion? Tell me how you got to that person, how you established that identity. ID of the animals is really important, though it's not necessarily an absolute requirement. It's pretty hard. I don't know if you guys have read studies about interracial identifications, but for one race to identify correctly a member of the other race, the accuracy is pretty low, right? All blondes look the same. Everybody with dreadlocks, they all look the same sort of thing. Imagine that interspecies, right? Trying to identify the dog. If this guy has 4 brindle pit bulls, how do I know which one attacked me unless there's blood on its mouth, right? So it can be hard, but really what you need to establish is that the person you are charging, one of those dogs, is the dog that attacked your victim. Ideally, you figure out which dog, but that's not necessarily the end of the game if you can't determine specifically which dog. Makes it harder to get that dog out of the community. We're not going to euthanize all 4 dogs if we can't figure out which dog it is, but it doesn't necessarily bar you from pursuing a prosecution because the culpable party is indeed the human, not necessarily the dog. Photos. I love photos. Overall photos, zoomed in photos. The next slide will have an example of how I really love photos, so I'll get to that in a minute.
Yeah, and then just typically, like when I'm building a case, I like to put myself in the defense attorney's shoes, and I picture myself up on the stand. I'm thinking, where are the gaps in this investigation? Did I seal everything up? Did I answer everything as much as I can? Because ultimately, I don't want to look like a fool up on the stand at a jury trial for a case that I investigated. So I often do that. The other thing that I didn't really touch on is just making sure we're getting all that evidence. So what can be left behind at a scene during one of these attacks? Blood, fur, collars, ripped clothes. Maybe if someone got on top of a car, there's scratches on the side of the car from the dogs, or there's dents from where the person was standing. Where did the scene happen in relation to where the dogs live? All that type of stuff, along with statements, definitely help out.
So he just went over the detailed reports. Measurements can be really helpful. Did the dog grab a hold of the child and drag the child? Is there a blood trail? Does that go to the severity of the attack? Yeah, take some measurements if you can. Witness statements. Obviously, do any folks here wear BWCs? Quite a few of you. Okay. Yeah, if you're wearing body-worn camera, obviously capture whatever you can on that. Those can be pretty powerful in court. Victim medical records, you can request those. They have to sign a HIPAA, right? But again, that SBI form, you don't necessarily need a HIPAA for. You can just hand it to the attending doctor, see if they will sign off and check one of those boxes. But again, that just helps us. It makes it easier for us to prove that there indeed was serious bodily injury if we have a doctor who could testify that to that. Neighborhood surveys are critically important. They are, I think, the most often overlooked part of an investigation. People will go to the immediate neighbors or maybe the house right behind. It is so crucial to canvass that block because the information that you might get is amazing. The footage of the dog running loose for 3 hours before, maybe attacked somebody else that didn't report it because it wasn't super serious, but now you're aware because you went to the house that didn't seem super relevant at the end of the block, but actually captured some pretty amazing footage. So make sure you are casting a wide net when you are doing those neighborhood surveys.
Yeah, the other thing with body-worn cameras is in Denver, we don't have them yet, but we do have telematics on our vehicles that show basically right in front of our vehicle and then a camera that faces us as well. So I know this is probably the last thing you're thinking about. You show up, your adrenaline's already pumping, you're showing up, the attack's happening. But if you can face your vehicle towards where the attack's happening, it can maybe capture some of that evidence for you.
Chris talked about the physical evidence, social media, be scouring social media. If you are trying to figure out, how do I peg this on this owner, if they have 75 pictures of themselves with this dog, odds are that's going to be your primary owner or caretaker of that dog, right? So do open source searches, and obviously premise owner dog specific history. You guys have Chameleon?
Chameleon, yep.
Chameleon? Great name for the system. Can you all hear me? I don't know. If you want, no worries, thank you. So yeah, look for that premise owner dog specific history because you guys have databases that aren't necessarily accessible to your local DA's office. So I might not know that Animal Protection has responded out to this residence 10 times before, that you guys have already consulted, that you're aware of this dog being an issue, that this owner is aware of this dog being an issue. So make sure you are not only running that history, but also providing that to us in your reports. Because if you don't mention it, if you don't include it, we don't know it's there. There's no way that we can go look at it like we could somebody's criminal history or something of that nature. Anything else?
Yeah, I guess like when we're investigating it, if the reporting party is giving us an address to where these dogs live, obviously we're not going to spend that extra 10 minutes sitting there typing, checking history. So I would, radio to maybe another officer, supervisor, whoever you can, to see if they can check history. So then once you get on scene, you kind of have a better idea of what your next steps will be.
This is pretty self-explanatory once I explain it, which means it's not self-explanatory. But what we have here is one of our officers at Denver Animal Protection took a number of photos. This was actually the little boy who got bit on the testicle. And the placement where the boy was compared to where the dog was relevant in the case. And as he went through and took pictures, obviously when he downloaded them, they all had a unique identifying number. And he was able to really make a cheat sheet for me. So I knew exactly what it was that he was photographing, where it was in the house. So I could literally recreate the scene just by looking at the photos and the description that he provided me. Now, if you have 100 photos, maybe this isn't practical, but if you have 10 or 15 photos and the layout of that location is relevant, just take a few minutes to sort of say, well, I was facing west, I was north. That helps us orient it. When we are making exhibits for our jury, we can make the exact exhibit with everything in the right spot, maybe even put the pictures in there. So this was just one of my favorite things. Wanted to share it. I thought it was a great idea and made my life real easy. Every PowerPoint needs a video, so we have a video for you. In theory.
Right now.
Come here! She's Brody! No! No!
Give her credit. She's trying.
I'm so sorry. I'm... Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
That's kind of it. Nothing else really happens. Obviously, this was mainly for entertainment value. And again, I mean, it's incredibly scary. I can't imagine that experience and having two dogs actively attacking you. Nor can I imagine being that owner, right? That is terrifying. Those are dogs that you love, that you, in theory, had no idea had the propensity to do this. So just really impactful video. Also, obviously you're probably knocking on this door if you know that this is where this attack happened. But perhaps these folks have moved by the time that you respond. Perhaps he walks back over to the house where this started and they are tending to him. Again, if you're not doing that broad neighborhood survey, you maybe miss your best piece of evidence at the house across the street. So again, just don't limit yourself. Don't go crazy. I know you don't have all day to be canvassing, but leave a business card, drop it off. That entire block will likely prove more helpful than not to you. All right, talking to victims and witnesses. There's always a lot of critique of law enforcement, animal protection, DAs included in that we just see cases as numbers and as cases. But what do we have behind those cases? People, right? We have victims, we have witnesses, we have people who have experienced sometimes the worst moment of their lives. And so just reminding yourself of that, this is our job. We really are pretty immune to a lot of this, right? A lot of people would run out of the room seeing those graphic images. We're just like, yep, that's another day in our lives. And when we respond to these calls, when we prosecute these cases, we take them seriously. I have no doubt about that. But it is just another case on our docket, just another investigation that we have handled. And so you sort of need to step back and just remember to be empathetic. You can express concern. When you respond to that scene, your first question should not necessarily be, which dog did this to you? Tell me who the owner is, right? It should be, oh my gosh, how are you? What can I do? And then maybe begin your investigation. But be a human first and foremost, because you're going to gain more cooperation from your victims. You're going to gain more compassion from the general public when you are extending compassion and empathy to their sisters, brothers, relatives, and whatnot. And you're just going to get a better case, and the system is going to treat them better. We have a case study at the end of this, and I'll sort of touch on the perspective of the victim, and it is not the most favorable. So it really does start with you. Plant that seed of compassion at the very beginning. And I'm also going to tell you, the more broad your questions, the more sensory-oriented your questions, the better your investigation is going to be, because you are going to get more details in that way. What are you able to tell me about your experience? Think how you would answer that. Think about something traumatic or even a wonderful experience that you had. If somebody asks you that broad, open-ended question of what do you remember most about what happened, think of all the details that are coming to mind. If I just say, which dog bit you, how much information are you going to get? Not a lot, right? That one. But what are you able to tell me about your experience? Well, I first remember hearing the dog bark, and then this other dog came up. I started running. I remember one of them tackled me. I remember somebody was honking. I remember one dog was holding on to my left arm and yanking me while the other one was holding on to my right foot. I remember smelling and tasting blood. I remember feeling the dog biting over and over again. Okay, I'm not exaggerating. Those are the details that you are going to get when you ask that open-ended question of tell me what your brain, what your senses recognized in that traumatic experience. So do that, not when did this happen, what time, which house were you in front of. You will get that information with that broader question. Can you tell me or show me where you are injured? Sometimes it's not always readily apparent. Maybe there's a really big gash on the leg, but they also say, I felt something on my arm. It's covered by their shirt. There might not be a puncture wound, but there might be a heck of a bruise when they lift up their shirt. So ask them to tell you. Don't just assume that you can see where they were injured. Again, what are you able to tell me about what you saw, heard, or smelled? Invoke those senses, because that is scientifically what your brains remember. And what detail can't you forget? Or what sticks out most in your memory? That's a great question to end on. Not, is there anything else I should ask you? Is there anything else you want to tell me? Because they're going to be like, I don't know, I think I told you everything. But maybe they didn't. Maybe there's one really vivid detail that they forgot to tell you. End with that question, not just, is there anything else? Just my suggestions. After years of doing this, you get a lot more with the stuff on the left than the stuff on the right.
Yeah, I think kind of the main point of this is whenever we're talking to anyone, right? Victims, witnesses, owners, we want them to keep talking as long as it's relevant. But the more that they talk, they might be, yeah, you guys know how that goes, right? But as long as they keep talking about what is relevant, they might throw something out there to you that you might pick up on, and it could be, a really good detail in your case that you can follow up with. And then owners, they don't have to talk to you. They can invoke those Fifth Amendment rights and say, no, I'm not talking to you. But if you can get them to talk, have them keep talking. They may incriminate themselves.
And just to be clear, that's not to say don't ask for the more specific details, right? You need to get that information out. When did this happen? Where did this happen? Do you know who owns the dog? I'm just saying, don't start with those questions. Let them really direct the investigation. Let them begin the narrative, and then follow up if there are details that are necessary to your investigation that you didn't get. You can follow up with those. Tara touched briefly on this, so I will just say cost of care is important. The notice that you provide is important. Again, this is potentially relevant to your consideration when you are talking about potentially taking this at the municipal or city level versus state level. At least in Denver, we have 2 different notices that we serve them. There are different applicable municipal codes and different statutes. And so just make sure that you are serving them the correct notice with the applicable law if you are pursuing state or muni. And obviously, this is hard, right? Because these dogs can languish for months, if not years. And it's a hard and serious impact for our shelters that are having to foot the bill and house these animals, even if cost of care is being paid. But it's also hard because that's not a fair situation for that dog. Whether its ultimate fate is going to be euthanasia or whether it is going to be released, the sooner we can resolve this, the better. But I would also say, not so much applicable in these cases as it might be a cruelty case, but if you can get that relinquishment, you certainly can't force it out of them. They are entitled to due process on that. But if you can sort of talk about that with the owner, they might recognize what they are setting their dog up for, months in confinement, and they might make the easier call then and there too. So I would just make sure that you are thoroughly explaining that and not just ripping it off and handing a notice. Make sure they understand, because that might work to your favor. They might say, oh my gosh, you mean you might have my dog for 6 months or a year? If that's the case, I'll sign the dog over. And then if that means it meets a quicker euthanasia and suffers less, or maybe you guys, deem it not dangerous, whatever, but at least you are you have the authority to dispose of the animal how you need to if they have signed it over. Penalties, I'll go through these real quick, but the class 5 felony is, all of these are probation eligible. So no matter what, the owner can get probation, or for the class 5 felony, again, the resulting in death, 1 to 3 years in the Department of Corrections. For the class 6 felony, which is just if it's a second or subsequent misdemeanor, so serious bodily injury or death or mutilation of a domestic animal, it's also probation eligible, or between 12 and 18 months in the Department of Corrections. Your regular M1 is going to be up to 364 days in jail. Your M2, which I think is just injuring a domestic animal or bodily injury, is only up to 120 days in jail. Ironically, at least in Denver, the municipal penalty is higher than our class 2 state misdemeanor. They can get up to 300 days in jail. For all of the state stuff, restitution shall be ordered. So that means potentially the owner is responsible for paying medical bills. If an owner suffered a loss of an animal, the person who is responsible for that loss potentially has to pay fair market value to replace that animal. So that can be really helpful. And then we have required euthanasia if serious bodily injury or death results to a person, or death to another animal, or for a second offense of the same dog. So again, our state statute says the court shall order euthanasia. So that is a big determination, because that is not necessarily the case in municipal violations. But if you are pursuing a state statute and a state prosecution ensues, it is required euthanasia. We no longer have the discretion, even if everybody agrees that that dog was it was a one-off. We do not have the discretion to change that if they are convicted, even of a deferred judgment at the state level. All right, case challenges. This is sort of a segue into the case that Officer Swanson's going to talk about. But sometimes these challenges are that you don't necessarily have a locatable owner. You figured out the dog, but who's it belong to? You can't charge the dog, right? We're not bringing the dogs to court. Or you have potentially someone that you believe is responsible, but they're saying, it's not my dog. It was wandering down the street, so I, as a good Samaritan, hooked it up and put it on a leash, but I've never seen the dog in my life, right? How do you overcome that? Figuring out which dog. Maybe the dogs are no longer on scene, but you know which house they belong to, but there's multiple dogs there, and the best description you have from your victim is, it was a dog. How do you figure out which dog, right? And then getting medical records to support an SBI finding can be a challenge, because again, not everybody has those forms at the ready. Perhaps you don't carry them. Perhaps you do and you dropped it off, but that doctor got busy, and after months and months of you emailing them, still has not returned it to you. So these are sort of some of the challenges we've identified. I'm just curious, does anyone have any other challenges like that you consistently find with these cases? No. You guys are just that good? They come easy? Okay. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Officer Swanson.
Okay, this is a case study, People versus Garcia. It was a case that I initially investigated and then was handed to a detective to pursue state charges. I believe it was February of last year, if I remember right. About 4 in the morning, I got a call. I was on call that night. Got a call from dispatch that a male party had been mauled by 2 brown and white pit bull type dogs. I spoke with an officer on scene before I responded. Officer said he had to put a tourniquet on the male party, and one of the bites may have nicked a femoral artery in the male party, and the male party was being transported to Denver Health Medical Center. PD actually had contacted this person right after the incident had happened, and he was loading his dogs up into the car. The PD at that time didn't know that that was associated with this specific incident. So super lucky there. They got the guy's name, what he was driving, his license plate. So we got really lucky there. And the reporting party actually was not the dog owner. It was a neighbor that heard the screaming, loud screaming coming from the road. It was a super snowy night. And so the owner of those dogs actually saw the attack happening, and it was an elderly male who the victim was, and saw both of his dogs mauling this guy from head to toe, bleeding profusely out, and he grabbed his dogs, pulled them back, and took off in his car. So that kind of goes back to how did the owner handle the situation, what we were kind of talking about earlier. Let's see. Oh yeah. There was another report that these same dogs attacked a female party who was scraping ice off of her windshield. Luckily, she was able to fight the dogs off with the ice scraper, got into her car, and didn't suffer any injuries from that. So super lucky. When I got on scene, there was a lot of snow. So there was red snow kind of everywhere. There was trash cans tipped over that had blood on it. So I kind of surveyed the whole block, kind of took a video to show how close the victim was to his house, and the victim was actually out walking his dog. So initially he was out walking his dog. Those 2 dogs were going after his dog. He intervened. The dogs turned on him. His dog was actually okay. But anyways, there was a blood trail leading all the way up to his house, on some handrails where you could tell he was grabbing and probably limping up the stairs. Big chunks of his flesh from his hand were on these handrails, leading all the way up to his house, doorknob filled with blood. The living room, kitchen had pools of blood in it. The boot that he was wearing was soaked with blood. So I documented all the evidence, spoke with that officer that was on scene. And then we ended up going to where the owner, Pedro, lived. We saw that same silver-colored sedan. I took pictures of the license plate, the car. I was able to see in plain view that there were bloody paw prints on the back seat. Took pictures of that. They weren't great pictures. It was dark. There's snow covering the window, but definitely showed that something had happened there. The next morning, well, that was the morning. Felt like 2 different days. It was such a long day. I ended up going to Denver Health Medical Center to see the victim. He was not moving, basically just looked like a mummy covered in medical supplies, bandages. From head to toe, he had several level 4 bites all throughout his body, literally from head to toe. I believe he fractured some bones in his hand. The muscle in his calf was completely out of one of his legs. And it was just super sad for me because I basically had to give him his water so he could drink. He couldn't move at all. So I was literally giving him water. So that really kind of motivated me at that point to see the victim, see how bad it was. And it gave me even more motivation to follow through with this case. Sorry, I'm gonna back up. So after I documented the whole scene, we found the car, took pictures. We tried to go to the owner's house to get the dogs and contact him, and I was there with police. Knocked on the door several times, heard the dogs barking, heard what sounded like someone from within the residence, doesn't answer. So then we ended up leaving. And then,
You went over all that.
yeah, so this is kind of what I was referring to earlier, the kind of flesh that's stuck there on his handrail. And then that green post was right there near the front of his residence. And the bloody doorknobs, you can tell he was just struggling to find support anywhere he could, just to make himself safe back into his house.
You went over that too.
Yep, and then this is, yeah, the vehicle that we located near the dog owner's house. Yeah.
These pictures don't do it justice. I mean, at all. This guy literally was mauled from head to toe. William Joseph,
Yep.
Is his name. And you can Google him. He has given many, many interviews to local media. We actually invited him to join us today, but he was working and couldn't take more time off. So this was a life-changing event for him. He actually worked at King Soopers. Obviously, he was off of work for a significant amount of time. And so the financial impact that this case had on him was tremendous. I will also say, this was a really challenging case. I mean, thank goodness there was snow on the ground, because that helped us really piece this together. When DPD initially responded to this, they let Mr. Garcia go because they did not connect the dots. They did a good job in realizing, hey, I should probably take note of this person. There's 2 dogs. Let me get the license plate. Let me figure out who this guy is. But they did not connect the dots and realize that those 2 dogs were the 2 dogs that had just attacked this victim, right? There's a lot going on. EMTs are on scene getting ready to transport Mr. Joseph, who really could have died, but for the neighbors hearing this and being able to call the cops because he was bleeding so excessively. And so our cops were kind of like, all right, victim almost dying. I got to focus on this. Oh, wait, this is weird. There's a guy with some dogs. Let me quick take down that information. All right, let's focus back on Mr. Joseph. And so by the time Officer Swanson got there, like, I'm getting calls of, there's no dogs on scene. We think we know the owner. DPD may have contacted the owner, and I'm going, what do you mean may have contacted the owner? Like, they let him go? And the answer was yes, because they just hadn't connected the dots. And then it wasn't until later when we learned about that second victim, and then we were connecting those dots. So again, these can be challenging cases. It's not every time that you're going to respond to the scene and the victim is perfectly placed. The dog is now sitting right next to it with the owner standing there waiting for its citation, right? These are challenging cases at times where you are going to have to, A, track down your victim. Has he already been transported, and to where? Or is he desperately trying to get into a neighbor's house to get help? You're going to have to track down the dogs, and you might have to track down the owner and the person responsible. You might also have resistance from law enforcement. Even when you say, I know the 2 dogs went back to this house, I don't know about your respective jurisdictions, but the Denver Police Department is not usually busting in doors to get dogs out of homes, right? And so you might have some resistance if that owner is not cooperative. And Mr. Garcia was not initially cooperative. Actually, I don't think he ever was. He really wanted those dogs back, and we were like, no. And so they can be very challenging cases, and this was just a good example of a case that sort of had a rocky start. People were kind of focused on different things. Nobody was really focused on the overall investigation until Officer Swanson got there and had to sort of piece it together so that we could connect all the dots so that we could actually prosecute Mr. Garcia and take these 2 dogs off the street. So these aren't easy cases to put together. This case ultimately pled to 1 count of M1, unlawful ownership of a dangerous dog. Our top charge, we just had 2 charges of unlawful ownership of dangerous dog for both dogs. And then we had, I think, 2 counts for the woman who had also been attacked. Her injuries were pretty insignificant, if I recall. So we just pled him to 1 of those counts. We did ask for jail on a misdemeanor. If you are getting probation, the maximum amount of jail you can get is 60 days. The judge imposed 7 days, much to our dismay. Both dogs obviously were euthanized pursuant to statute, and also those dogs were not going to be released, I don't think, in anybody's opinion, to be back in the community. And Mr. Garcia was ordered to pay restitution. I will admit that you guys put in a lot of work for that resolution, right? It is frustrating. It is frustrating for us too. It is hard when you are trying to balance someone who may not have significant criminal history, when you are dealing with somebody who might not necessarily be on notice that their dogs are vicious or are likely to engage in this behavior. Those are considerations and calculations that we have to make. We are also dealing with a judiciary that does not necessarily perceive these cases as serious as they are. And that is sort of where you guys come in terms of educating your local law enforcement, your local DAs, your city attorneys. And if it's a case that you care about, if you keep in touch with that victim, if your local DA tells you, hey, we set sentencing over at this date and time, feel free to show up. I mean, I don't know of any jurisdiction that's going to say, get out of here. We don't want you here for the sentencing hearing, because you guys can provide some pretty powerful and impactful statements. This is the most egregious attack I've seen in my 15 years as a Denver Animal Protection Officer. Oops. All right. Those are things that can be very impactful to judges because they're not seeing a lot of these, quite frankly. And so they don't have that scale or that spectrum. So feel free to chime in. Your local DAs or prosecuting attorneys are not going to take offense. And if they do, that's on them, not on you. But reach out to them. They will likely be receptive. If you tell them, hey, this case is really serious, from all the cases that I've seen, I'm really hoping for some jail time, or I'm really hoping that you won't plead this down. Just reach out. Show that you're invested. They will likely be receptive and welcome that feedback, and you can start to build those relations. Oh, I did say I was going to briefly touch on Mr. Joseph. When I talked to him to see if he wanted to come to this, he said, the most important thing that I want you to impress upon the folks there is that these cases matter and how victims are treated throughout this process matters. And I don't think he had any issue with law enforcement or Officer Swanson. His primary bone to pick, quite frankly, was with my office. He did not feel that that was an appropriate penalty. But above and beyond our office, he was grateful for the prosecution of it. He was very kind, very respectful throughout the entirety of the case, which resolved a month or two ago. So only about a year, actually a little longer than that. So a fairly expedient resolution, but he didn't feel like the penalties were appropriate. And as DAs, our hands are somewhat tied, right, by what the legislature has dictated is an appropriate penalty. We are aware of what our judges' inclinations are, and so we cater a lot of our dispositions to our judges because we have to. If I'm asking for probation and I know my judge is only going to take a step to DOC, that's stupid. I'm not going to offer probation if I know the judge is going to reject it, and vice versa. But he just really felt that victims' voices are not heard, that the system is not for victims. And I had to respond to him to that. I said, it's not, right? Our Constitution rightly protects the rights of defendants. There is very little, despite the Victims' Rights Act, codifying victims' rights. It is a re-traumatization of victims every step of the way, every phone call that they get from our office, every disappointing resolution of a case that they get. There's not a lot in our system for victims. And so I will just remind you, as again I already said, just be empathetic. Be that first friendly face of the system because you are the introduction to the criminal justice process for them. I am the end, and it is incumbent upon me to end it on the highest note that I can, but it really starts with you. So make them feel like they are your first and only victim. Investigate their cases, invest in them, and we will all just have a better system at some point. I'm overly optimistic, I recognize that, but we can try to get there. So with that, we have left you all 3 minutes for questions. If anybody has any questions, go ahead and shoot. Yeah, in the blue.
So going back to the cost of care, and I understand on a state level this is a much higher ask, but like my jurisdiction, it is in our code that we have to have expedited hearings. If we have an animal in our custody that we're holding, we have to expedite that hearing just for what you said, so it doesn't drag out for months and ultimately actually cost people a lot more money.
Mm-hmm. So in the statute, I believe it has to be, in theory, held within 10 days that notice is served or that seizure is made, which often coincide, right? A lot of folks waive that or their attorneys will waive that, and so it could be 30 or 45 days out. Even if you have that hearing, really it's just a determination of whether or not the owner or custodian has to continue to make those payments. And if they elect to make those payments, there's really nothing we can do to sort of seize that dog or take that dog from them. Because if ultimately a jury finds not guilty, right, if this goes to trial and there's a not guilty verdict, they get that dog back. Potentially, at least under the criminal side. There might be issues with, hey, the shelter literally cannot release this dog for liability reasons, sort of thing. But separate and apart from that, there's really not a mechanism for us to expedite the actual seizure of the animal. Yeah, it's really hard. Yeah. It could. I mean, by statute, it is supposed to happen early on, and it usually does. It might not be that 10 days. In Denver, it's pretty rare, at least at the state level. I'm not seeing a lot of them go in those initial 10 days. A lot of that is Denver's just special. And our court processes really, judges are like, what's this? What am I supposed to be doing? They don't have discovery yet. They don't have their attorneys. But it should be happening early on. And if it's not, that's a conversation you're going to want to have also with your DAs, because they can push for that to, hey, judge, there's actually a statute that says this should happen now. Yeah. Go ahead.
How did you guys end up getting the dogs since you weren't answering the door?
Yeah, if I remember correctly, I think we went the next day with police, and
He finally did.
and he answered the door, I believe, and we ended up getting the dogs.
I think it was actually a relative of his that came to the door, and we were like, hey, is Pedro there? Because we can see him.
Yeah.
And finally came out and escorted
Like
the dogs.
peeking around the corner.
Yeah. No, he finally cooperated. But we have had situations where we have had to do search warrants to go in and get the dog, and that is an uphill battle that I have to fight. And I understand, law enforcement's reticence to do that. It's a dangerous situation. So we usually just kind of hound them until they finally come to the door.
I was just curious if there was previous history with those dogs in particular.
I don't believe so. I don't believe we had history with him or the dogs, if I'm
They
remembering
might have been like running at
correctly.
large, but
Oh, maybe they were loose at some point years
yeah, I
back.
think there was like a running at large, but nothing where it was like a house on our radar.
Yeah.
Well timed, 3:21. All right, please take a photo if you would like. Of our last slide, both Officer Swanson and myself are happy to answer any questions at any point. It was a pleasure to be invited to be here today, so thank you to Colorado Department of Agriculture and BAP.
Yeah, thank you guys.